Hello YouTube and welcome to another video. Today we're going to dismantle the whole bands around the knees thing. First from a practical perspective and then from a more of an anatomical based perspective. I have my femur, my hips, and my fiber direction. For those of you who have seen other videos, this is basically what I use to orient or illustrate fiber direction rather. So when we're talking about bands around the knees, generally speaking, we're talking about doing it during exercises like squats, deadlifts, hip thrusts, and those kinds of things that we predominantly view as glute biased exercises, glute max biased exercises, right? But when we put a band around the knees, we create this force direction for our hips to effectively resist that is not actually within the plane that we're trying to move in. So to make it a little bit more simple in terms of just visualizing this, imagine that you're doing a squat. Okay, and this is the bottom position of the squat and this is the top position of the squat, right? So this is you standing and this is you in the bottom. The direction, or really the plane of motion that you're moving in terms of the hip, is effectively what looks like this, right? And so adding a band for you to resist in this direction is actually only taking away from your ability to produce force down into the floor, be it a deadlift, a squat, a hip thrust. Maybe an easier visual just to begin with is like something like a leg press, right? Where you can clearly see the loading moving like in a linear direction down toward you. You want to push the foot plate away from you. You don't want to try to push it to the right or push it to the left. You want to push it straight forward. Now, some of you may be thinking, oh, well, if I put a band around my knees, won't that like activate my hips more? Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but if you think about this from like a total percentage of load standpoint, imagine you're like squatting for reps of 225 and the band may provide what, like 10 or 15 pounds of resistance. It's an insignificant amount of resistance for just basically extra muscle masturbation that's happening here to basically just take away from the efficiency of you trying to push through the floor in one direction, right? The reason that we don't necessarily want to see knees moving inward or outward in a squatting type motion is mostly for an efficiency sake, right? We want to basically just resist the force that's trying to smush us toward the floor, or in the case of a leg press, toward the back of the seat, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. The short of it is basically just resist the direction that the force is pushing you. Don't add any sort of extra force in a random direction that doesn't make any sense whatsoever to actually create, force in that direction relative to where the most of the load is pulling you or pushing you. Okay, so that's one. Two, from an anatomical perspective, when we look at the glute max, right? The glute max is going to sit, if I can hold this like this, the glute max is going to sit on the back side of the pelvis, and because it's a fan-shaped muscle, what it's going to do is it's going to attach from several points. I'm just going to get rid of my femur here for a sec. It's going to attach from several points on top of the hip down to the femur. It's going to kind of run like in this direction here. So if you can picture it, attachment site, attach, all the way down to the bottom of the coccyx. So basically the attachment sites span from here all the way down to here, and they run into the back of the femur and the IT band, but we'll just talk about the femur for now. The back of the femur in this direction, or from this perspective, where the fibers, when they're sort of running into the side of the femur, sort of look like this, right? If like my leg is like this, they sort of go up and backward. They don't go up and outward to the side. So what that really means, if we put these two things together, is that the fibers of the glute max, when my hip is flexed or up in this position, want to pull the leg down, because that, if you could picture how that fiber direction will change, right? The fiber is sort of running again from those points I mentioned down to the hip like this. When I move my leg upward, it's going to wrap down and underneath and then pull the leg down, whether it's in sort of more of a straightforward plane or slightly out to the side. It's going to pull the leg downward. It's not really going to pull the leg outward. There is a slight outward vector of pull with this upper glute max that'll attach more to the IT band, but it's very, very subtle, and it's not at all in this plane here or in this plane here. So, if we're in a standing position, right, or we're in doing something like a hip thrust, right, where our hips are like pretty much close to this position the entire time, or a very small range of motion, the muscle that is going to resist a pull of like a band pushing the leg in this way are the ones that sit right here, i.e. something like the glute min, which is going to attach basically around this degree, and then the glute med, which has various divisions but runs sort of similarly on the side of the hip. So the glute min and the glute med are going to be the things that pull the leg outward in this position, and if we took the leg up to this position where we're in the bottom of a squat or the bottom of a leg press, something like that, now the thing that's going to actually pull the leg out is this big piriformis guy that sits on the back side of the hip. If I can illustrate this maybe more clearly with the other side. You might ask why I haven't done that so far. It basically sits from the back of the sacrum here, the piriformis, and when the hip is flexed up, if if I can move my foot, if the hip is flexed up to this position, it's basically going to run from here to here, right where my hand is, and that's going to create a really, really efficient line of pull for that piriformis when the hip is sort of up in that flex position. So the piriformis is going to be excellent at basically moving the leg in this sort of a plane, right? Sort of picture like the seated good girl, bad girl machine, the seated abduction. That's a great exercise for the piriformis and some of the glute med, the glute min. Obviously the glute max will contribute very minimally. But for the most part, whether I'm in this plane or I'm in this plane, you could make the argument that like, okay, glute min, glute med territory down here, glute med / piriformis territory up here, right? But we're not going to really be recruiting glute max in either of those planes, particularly, especially in the straight out to the side abduction one. So again, if you even wanted to make an argument for like adding a band to any exercise, it wouldn't be an exercise for the glute max, and it wouldn't be an exercise that is loaded in any direction that's sort of linearly like a deadlift, a squat, a hip thrust, or a leg press, okay? So what will be good exercises or what will be better exercises if you wanted to load this direction or this direction? Well, I just mentioned that the seated abduction is a fantastic option, right? It's directly loaded, it's supported. You don't have to try to combine motions weirdly to create weird amounts of co-contraction and coordination here. You can basically just move your leg in this plane and load it directly, or you could pick like a cable kick out or something where the cable would be loading, you know, from the perspective of this skeleton, it would be loading the person this way, loading across the body, kicking out to the side. That would be a great exercise for the glute min, glute med. All right, so you have all these different options that can load that motion really specifically if that's something that is a part of your goal. But if your goal is to load the glute max, you want to pick exercises that are sort of loaded in this vector or this vector slightly out, like a leg press, like a deadlift, like a squat, that doesn't have a band around the knees. Again, the band is really just forcing you to do this or to do this when the glute max just really wants to do this. So if you're putting yourself into a position where you're trying to do all those things at the same time, you're creating an excessive amount of just useless noise that's only going to take away from the force output of you being able to directly resist the resistance, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. If any of you have any questions, need me to specify things a little bit more in the comment section, please let me know and I will get to those comments as best that I can.